Religion was never the centerpiece of Berserk when it started all the way back in 1989. Sure, the first proper major villain of the series was a heretic hunter, but that was more in service of the slug count's characterization than actual world building in our eyes. Things become decidedly more spiritual Eclipse onwards as Miura starts introducing and playing with the idea that his entire story was predetermined by God, which is probably why he retroactively had Chapter 83 removed from his continuity. In his words, it gave away too much about his epic saga, but that chapter, and a few others, held the key to cracking open the mystery we posed in the title of this video. God became an important part of the story from the Conviction arc onwards, but as we mentioned earlier, his influence permeates the story from the very beginning. So, let's get into it. This is the definitive answer to the question, are there gods in Berserk? Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Well, you can't have things preordained by fate if you don't have a god doing the ordaining. The introduction of God in Berserk. Technically speaking, and we're talking real nuts and bolts here, the concept of God was introduced in the Black Swordsman arc itself when we first met the God Hand. Because how can you have a hand of God without an actual god being behind it? The God Hand is clearly based off of this early Christian motif, which was frequently used during late antiquity and the early medieval period, as it was considered unacceptable to draw an image of God in his entire fullness. The Hand of God is used as a motif for several things across both Christian and Jewish iconography, but we'd argue its main function is to display the supreme authority of God over everything in this world. The hand passed the Tablet of Commandments to Moses, handed Ezekiel his prophecy, accepted Jesus' sacrifice. You get the idea. The Hand of God was essentially used to signify God's involvement in major developments in the Christian faith, and it looks like Miura took that idea literally for his creation. Though the God Hand's arrival in Berserk does not feature the now iconic Hand of God lurking in the background, it does show up in mostly every appearance made by the God Hand as a collective Eclipse onwards. And speaking of the Hand of God, it's curious that Miura specifically chooses to base his design of the structure on the right hand of God, which is interpreted as being a favored position at the right side of God in heaven. According to the Session of Christ, Jesus is seated at the right hand of God in heaven, and therefore, that position is often associated with the ultimate position of honor. And then there's the concept of the divine right of kings, which entails that a monarch derives their ruling authority thanks to divine ordinance, which is symbolized as the hand of God placing a wreath or a crown upon said monarch's head in images and frescoes and such. Miura took these spiritual concepts and put a decidedly demonic twist to it, because from the very beginning, it's clear that the God Hand are demonic entities in service to the ideal of evil. Apostles in Berserk aren't the faithful followers of the Son of God, but human beings reincarnated by their strong wills and their unparalleled desires to achieve something, no matter the cost. Miura clearly drew inspiration from Christianity even as early on as the Black Swordsman arc, but that's all it was restricted to, inspiration. As we've mentioned already, religion didn't exactly play a huge role in Berserk for like the first 100 chapters or so. Instead, the story was focused on Guts' journey into becoming the Black Swordsman and his struggle against the concept of fate itself. But then again, who governs fate if not God? The very idea of fate as something that dictates the lives of men is tied into a supernatural guiding hand that most believers of fate and destiny think are providing direction to their lives. Fate was a strong concept in the prehistoric world, as evidenced by the iconography of the three sisters of fate, who apparently spin and weave the destinies of all living things in Greek mythology. The Fates had one job and one job only: to ensure that mortals and divine entities alike live out their destinies as it was intended for them. As such, their moral authority extended over even Zeus, the king of the gods, and the Fates themselves were birthed from primordial divine beings. In most world mythologies, the concept of fate is rarely divorced from divine intervention. If destiny has already decided what lies at the end of the journey for a man, then the writer of that destiny surely has to be God. Applying that same logic to Miura's tale would have told you that yes, there is a god in Berserk in the first arc of the story itself, but we get that that might have been buried underneath the madness that was Guts' time as the terrifying Black Swordsman. The God Hand on multiple occasions claims that the slug count was one preordained by fate, and when the count rejects sacrificing his daughter to ensure his own survival, the God Hand Void declares that the threads of fate have been severed. This indicates that the God Hand acts as the executors of an evil god's will, and that much is confirmed for us during the eclipse, even with the omission of Chapter 83. When Void welcomes the apostles to this sacred nocturnal feast, he calls them the lambs of the ungodly god born of man, before charging them to enjoy their feast to the fullest. Then later, when the God Hand performs its manipulative routine on Griffith, Void once again says that the demise of a human being's dream is part of the cruel grace of the ungodly god born of man. It was Void's claim that Griffith could either be content with the burial of his own self within the ruin of his dreams, or pile up the bodies of his comrades and take what was his with raven black wings that would allow him to reach summits yet untouched. Griffith, of course, chose the latter and chanted the words necessary for marking his band of the Falcon with the brand of sacrifice. At that moment, the God Hand manifested within the interstice clamped shut on his body, as his astral self, or his soul, sunk into the depths of the abyss. Griffith felt his comrades' deaths pierce through his literal soul, and yet claims to have felt nothing, and he sank deeper and deeper. Once he reached the bottom, he saw a shimmering pool from which Behelits poured forth like so many tears. Griffith wondered why Behelits would be in such a place when his questions were answered by an unseen voice. This voice was revealed to be a massive lump of flesh that resembled the human heart at the end of chapter 82, and the final words of that chapter saw Griffith address this thing as God. Now, if you guys followed the reading order that Kentaro Miura wanted his readers to follow, then kudos to you because you're more patient than us. The chapter that Berserk's God actually appears in, chapter 83, remains a topic of controversy within the Berserk fandom till this date, in that people are still divided whether it should be treated as canon or not. We at the Marvelous family treat it as canon, so let's talk about the supposed supreme being that governs all life in Berserk, the idea of evil. Idea of evil, sea god, and other divine residents of the astral world. In chapter 83, Griffith's soul encounters the idea of evil within the swirling abyss and is astonished to realize that this thing was his god. God apparently had no time to take a proper human form, so he just put his eyes all over his heart instead. And trust us when we say he had a lot of eyes. At first, Griffith is confused and almost disturbed at the revelation that this lump of flesh was God, but as the idea explains the reasons behind its existence, it makes more and more sense. All magic and astral developments in Berserk occur thanks to the human mind. Though people don't realize it, it is their irrational fear of werewolves and hydras and dragons and such that give birth to such creatures within the womb of the astral world. The idea of evil was nothing more than the generator of the reasons that mankind desired to explain their tortured existence. It took form from the dark side of humanity's collective consciousness and exists to solely perpetuate that darkness till the end of time, presumably. The idea of evil has seemingly orchestrated every major event of the series, especially Griffith's Eclipse, over the course of hundreds of years by fashioning causality in accordance with the human will. It uses the God Hand as an extension of its will in the astral world that lies above the abyss, and the human world beyond even that, which ties neatly into our Little Hand of God exposition from the earlier section. If you want to know more about this entity, you should check out our Origins video on it because there's a lot of interesting stuff that we can't cover in this video, but the idea of evil is not the only god that exists in Berserk, as mentioned by the best girl of the whole entire series, Shirke. When Guts and his party reach Flora's Spirit Tree Mansion, the Black Swordsman decides to get all his pressing magical questions about the Behelit and the God Hand out of the way as soon as possible. The expositional dump given to us by both Shirke and Flora reveals many things about the nature of the astral world, which we will talk about in another video. But the gist of it is this: there are three worlds overlapping one another in Berserk. The physical world we're all familiar with. The astral world is called the Realm of Spirits by Shirke, and she explains that this is where things like souls and other astral creatures like elves and trolls reside. The third realm is the world of ideas, which we know next to nothing about from the official canon. The only thing known about this third world is that it is the soul of the origin of the all of existence. It could be that the reason we don't know anything about this particular world ties into the reason for the omission of chapter 83 from the continuity, but more on that later. Flora takes over the exposition from her disciple and explains that things like ogres, unicorns, and other fabled beasts are things humans have clearly imagined and believed in for generations, which is why the Black Swordsman party can perceive Puck and Ivalira the way they do. Guts and Casca's brand of sacrifice also helps with this perception. Then she states that the interstice is actually the shallow layer of the astral world, and that as one goes deeper and deeper within it, the landscape becomes unimaginable, and the power of the beings dwelling in those depths becomes unfathomable. She says that things like angels, demons, and gods of polytheism polytheism exist in this realm, and we instinctively know that she's talking about the God Hand in particular here. Notice how every time the God Hand is summoned through an interstice, the landscape changes into something completely bizarre? In the Black Swordsman arc, it was a Hellraiser-esque labyrinth of stairways that bent at angles that do not exist in regular geometry. During Griffith's eclipse, it was a dimension of tortured faces. The God Hand has already been established as the extensions of the will of the idea of evil, Berserk's only confirmed godlike figure so far, so that part is covered. What's more interesting is the gods of polytheism bit, as this is where one of Berserk's most underrated villains comes into play. The sea god might have had a relatively short-lived existence in the Berserk manga, but it served various purposes, chief of which was verifying Flora's claim about gods of polytheism existing in deeper layers of the astral world. The sea god manifested within the physical world when Griffith, in his release state as Femto, broke the seals of the world spiral tree and caused it to come spilling into the physical world and take it back to a state of Fantasia. The sea god was revered on Isma's island as a monstrous deity who would devour all sea life within its vicinity. Though he was eventually defeated by a school of Marrows, the islanders ended up worshipping the sea god out of fear instead, even when he wasn't present in the physical world. So when he returned with the Great Roar, the first thing he did was assimilate Isma's entire village into his hideous Charybdis-esque being and start harassing all sea life within his vicinity once again. It took guts entering the sea god's body and slashing open its heart from the inside to take it down permanently, and this was our first display of those gods of polytheism and their power that Flora was talking about back in chapter 201. There are sure to be more primordial elemental deities like the sea god all across the world now that Fantasia's up and running, but Guts & Co didn't have time to fight all of them on their way back to Elfhelm. That's the gods of polytheism bit covered. However, you might have noticed that everything we've spoken about has been, thus far, decidedly evil in nature. Berserk is known for its extremely dark themes, tone, and pacing, so we get why some people might think that the idea of evil and everything associated with it is the only kind of divine existence in all of Berserk. But that's not the truth. The four elemental kings exist as near divine beings that personify the four major elements of the world and love and protect humanity as their cardinal angels. Shirke and Flora seem to believe in God, but they definitely aren't referring to the idea of evil in their discussions about God's power and the fates he assigns. Flora in particular seems to think that destiny might be preordained, but it only becomes truth if the person it is destined for decides to walk that path and embrace it instead of struggling against it. Guts is the only person in the story who outwardly rejects fate. Even the Skull Knight has more faith in causality than his own millennia-long struggle. But Berserk is a story that is all about the dualities of life, and going by that logic, if there's an idea of evil, there must also be an idea of good out there somewhere. Out of the three worlds of Berserk, the world of ideas is the one that is the least explored so far. It is possible that the scene between Griffith and the idea of evil takes place in this realm, but there's no way to confirm it now that Miura-sensei is no longer with us. Unless Kujimori and Studio Gaga decide to canonize chapter 83 and dive headfirst into the more esoteric concepts of Berserk's spiritual worlds, the idea of good remains but a pipe dream. And yet, we can't help but think that we've already seen it at work. We all know that Guts has done many heinous things in his revenge quest against the God Hand and Griffith specifically, but as a struggler against fate, he stands out as the primary candidate for someone whose life was preordained by the idea of good. Despite having a savage nature to him, Guts more often than not chooses to do the right thing when the choice is his to make, and unlike Griffith, he openly shows remorse for his bad acts. Another obvious candidate for someone being preordained by the idea of good is Rickard, and we're not just saying that because of what happened in Slapconia. Sorry, Alconia. Rickard is a character that has always been aligned with good in the series. Even after learning about what Griffith did to his comrades, he didn't hold any hatred in his heart for the man. He just had a lot of disappointment, we think. That slap might have been motivated by anger, but it didn't come from a place of resentment. Rickard is about as lawful good as Berserk can get, and the motivation behind that slap might have been a simple lesson to teach Griffith that he isn't as all-powerful as he thinks himself to be. Rickard is also currently primed for a rather explosive side quest, we think, because he's currently headed to the Bakiraka mountain hideout with none other than hookah-loving Daiba. There are other characters in Berserk that can claim to be extensions of the idea of good as well, like Luca and Roderick, but that's not the point we're trying to make. When we say the word God, the first thought in your head isn't what Miura intended the God Hand or the idea of evil to be for his story. It's the Lord Almighty, the one above, the creator himself. God is often associated with a good entity that loves and protects humanity humanity, even though he likes giving out a few harsh punishments from time to time, like, you know, sending a world-ending flood. Though Berserk is a dark story, evil isn't the only thing within it. Kindness and characters who are motivated to do good are plentiful in this story, and it just might be that they're the ones who are actually in service of the god that the Holy See adherents think Griffith is a personification of. Marvelous verdict. But as for this video, that's gonna have to be it. We could have made a long story short and just said, yes, gods exist in Berserk, but we know you guys are here for the analytical more than anything, so we thought we'd go all in on explaining how and why they exist as well. Let us know what you think about Berserk's unique interpretation of this supreme being in the comment section down below, and we'll see you guys in the next one. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one, be safe out there, and thanks for watching.